Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be here. Would also just like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which we meet on today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. It'd be remiss of me as well not to acknowledge the life members of UnionsWA in the room, both Keith and Stephanie. So thank you for being here, and of course the current president, Steve McCartney. Thanks to Labour History Society for inviting me along tonight. It is a rite of passage for every new UnionsWA Secretary to be kind of dragged in front of this group to give a speech. And I'm told if you like me enough, you'll drag me back again by the time I retire as well. So, we'll see how I go tonight and see if I get an invite back. It's a great privilege to present the Harold Peden Lecture this evening. I've been in the crowd many times. And I appreciate, the ability to come after so many great leaders of the union movement to give this lecture tonight. Harold, of course, was one of the most respected union leaders of his time, and I reflect, having worked at the AMWU for some time, the legacy that he had left at the AMWU that was still evident, even when a young bloke like me was kicking around the place. He was, of course, a life member of the Trades and Labour Council and one of the founding members. And again, the legacy that he's left around occupational safety and the TLC still lingers today. He was, of course, very active in the previous round of occupational health and safety reforms in the 80s, which I will talk about a fair bit tonight. And it's worth acknowledging that he was one of the founding members of the Trades and Labour Council and actually also established the occupational health and safety position at UnionsWA, which is a position that still lingers on today. Also, just before kind of getting into the topic, I also thought it was worth acknowledging Neil Byrne, of course, a long friend of Labour History Society, the AMWU and UnionsWA, long-time stalwart of all these groups and this lecture. I reflect working at the AMWU. It was Neil who, I suppose, first started to educate me about Harold when I began work there. And as a pretty young guy trying to find my way in the union movement, Neil had a certain way of occupying the seat in my office opposite my desk in a very Neil way for quite long periods of time. It took a little while, but after a while I started to realise actually that he was doing his own form of education of me, of occupational health and safety, the values of the union movement, the values that Harold had left in the organisation, and the importance of collective unionism. So, it's through the leadership of Harold and others like Neil that, it's worth acknowledging that people like me kind of walk in their footsteps in terms of the legacy that they've left and the responsibility on leaders in the union movement to kind of maintain that legacy. Tonight, I wanted to reflect on the challenges that we face in work health and safety. I'll also talk about the campaign that we have run to move the legislation and the community on bringing health and safety kind of back into a union space. And I was also going to reflect, if I haven't gone way over time, on I think the challenges that are coming for the union movement in the near future in the space. I also want to reflect on why safety is core union business, why we can't rely on employers or regulators to have workers or unions back in the space. It's always been a great interest of mine, occupational health and safety. Aside from diligently joining my union as a 17-year-old starting off in the workforce, my first interaction with unions was actually around occupational health and safety. Now, I'm well known in the UnionsWA office of essentially refusing to ever tell a personal story, but for this one time only, I think I'll lean into the personal story narrative that kind of is pervasive in progressive politics and the union movement. When I first started work out of school as a 17-year-old, folding boxes in a food production facility, of course joined my trade union, as all young people in the workforce should. Soon then moved on to doing kind of more horticulture and agricultural work. I worked in this role for a number of years until one day rushing around the kind of food production factory, slipping on some slurry that had kind of been left from some alfalfa that had been grown, cracked my head on the concrete floor, knocked unconscious in a sealed room with no other workers in the vicinity for not really sure how long. Soon after leaving that room, kind of wandering out, heavily concussed, walked out of the factory, jumped in my car and drove home, got home, didn't know where I was, didn't know what day it was, until some friends kind of who I was calling on the phone quickly figured out I was in trouble. Soon after that, I jumped on the phone to my union, which was the MISOs at the time, now United Workers Union, and was very quickly patched through to Janine Freeman, of all people, who was, of course, working as a safety and workers' compensation officer at United Workers Union, who took the matter extremely seriously, got me sorted, got me to a doctor, and got my workers' compensation claim sorted. And as a young guy who, probably didn't even know what workers' compensation really was at the time, it really showed to me the value of trade unions and actually the importance of unions taking occupational safety and workers' compensation seriously. And from there, I was, when torn between going back to work or going to work in the union movement, kind of made the decision at that point to go and work in the union movement and dedicate my life to left politics and the trade unions. So, when I reflect on the legacy that Harold and Neil have left around occupational health and safety, I reflect that both as a worker and as a young union official, and still a young union official, I've been a great beneficiary of the reforms that they have led and they have made. However, in the years where I've kind of taken responsibility in the union movement, moved into a leadership position, I've witnessed the outcomes of the undermining of the reforms that Harold had implemented and the union movement had fought for quite some time. So just to talk about kind of those reforms of the 80s first, before I move through to the challenges. Prior to the reforms that Harold and others had implemented in the 80s, occupational safety was really the boss's domain. The law gave workers very little rights to protect themselves and very little rights to be involved in occupational health and safety. Management made decisions and implemented them. There was no consultation or involvement of workers in the safety space. The lack of kind of worker involvement and the nature of kind of patronising kind of top-down decision-making on safety led to perverse outcomes in our workplaces. Industrial death and disease was very high and was really just seen as a cost of doing business. Regulation was light and expectation from government and industry was extremely low. Rightfully, those involved in the movement at the time saw that this was not good enough. The union movement at the time around Australia looked to reforms in the United Kingdom, the Robins reforms, and I'm sure that's known very well to a lot of you, which really kicked off in Britain in the early 1970s. Those reforms really led to looking at worker involvement in occupational safety, occupational health and safety committees, occupational health and safety representatives, and the importance of workplace structures and workplace democracy to ensuring that workers are safe in their workplaces. That all sounded pretty good, I think, to unions in Australia, and they pursued those reforms strongly. WA was an adopter of the Robins laws framework in the mid-80s, 86. And it's worth reflecting that those reforms took quite a long time to get. It was really the TLC who began kind of demanding those reforms in the early 80s, and they had a slow series of wins to start to develop a better framework and series of laws to protect workers in these states. Began with winning an Occupational Health and Safety Commission, and then went on to battling government kind of for further reforms after that. And I think in 1986, after the state election, the second term of the Byrne government, the union movement got what they wanted and achieved very significant wins in occupational health and safety. Namely, and I could spend hours talking about this issue alone, but I'm not going to try and bore you with occupational health and safety minutiae too much tonight, just the right amount, I hope. But, they really enshrined worker involvement in OSH at that time. And also the right for workers to cease work when it was unsafe, which at its time was a pretty controversial policy. The establishment of an OSH commission, safety reps, and a whole variety of other, of their time, radical reforms in occupational safety. And it's worth reflecting that legislation has worked. In 1988, we had about 50 workplace deaths per million workers in this state. In the 90s, that dropped down to about 20, And in 2020, it sits at around 10 per million. So quite a massive drop of workplace death in this state. And that's entirely attributable to these reforms and the campaigning of the trade union movement through the time. I would reflect, though, that we still have a lot to do in this space, as great as those numbers sound. We are seeing fatalities climb in WA, and it was with a great shame, actually, this week that we saw stats released that talked about 29 workers who were killed in 2020, well up from kind of the kind of numbers that have been in the high teens or the low 20s before that. But these reforms, did drop workplace death and workplace injury substantially. And I think we know for every life that we save, we're also stopping kind of hundreds, if not thousands, of workers from very serious injury. I think after winning and establishing these structures, it's worth reflecting that I think in the late 2000s and kind of recently, I think unions have taken their foot off the pedal a bit around occupational safety. And while this legislation, the 80s legislation, was good for its time, I think it is old and outdated. The legislation came into effect the same year I was born and is still in effect today. And it's just worth reflecting that workplaces don't look the same as they did in the 80s. We've got labour hire, we've got the pervasive and evil nature of the gig economy, we've got whole layers of contracting that are impacting our workforce, and a structure or an act that was built for how workplaces looked in the 80s, where you had very large workplaces and largely single employer workplaces, just doesn't reflect how workplaces look now. The current act, while operated extremely well in the 80s and 90s, has started to lose its relevance to workplaces, I think, in recent times. The Act also doesn't reflect emerging areas of workplace safety, areas like psychosocial health, which is a big campaigning point for union movement at the moment and in recent years. And especially, those issues associated with workload, work pressures, and things like FIFO work. And while that Act has started to become outdated, I would reflect that we've also seen the eroding of structures and the eroding of permanent wins of the union movement by both regulators and employers. And what I'm really planning to kind of go through before I go to the legislation is to talk about some of those major challenges that have undermined both the letter and the intent of the reforms in the 80s and the modern challenges that we've faced in that space. And the first of those major challenges that I'll touch on, and I'll touch on these to, I suppose, give context of our campaign for the reforms and our campaign for better laws. The first I was going to touch on was silicosis. And I'm aware there's a number of people in this room that have probably understand this issue a lot better than me, and Lynn, who's in the room, who sits on the Occupational Safety Commission with myself, who was an expert in the area. But I've really become aware of one of the key things that's undermining those well-fought union wins has been the undermining of the safety nets in the Act designed to protect workers. And despite the OH Act being drafted in the early 80s, it is actually far superior to more modern safety laws as it comes to kind of health monitoring and health surveillance of workers. The health monitoring provisions in the 80s laws require regular health checks of workers where there is any risk in the kind of workplace atmosphere to a harm of health. And that's really delivered substantial benefits for working people in this state. But despite these extremely strong provisions that were designed to protect workers, in recent years we've seen the negligence of employers and the absence of regulators lead to serious workplace disease of working people in this state. The dangers of silicosis have been very well known since the 1800s. And in fact, there's evidence that the Greeks and Romans knew very well the effect of dust on the lung health of workers, even well before that. And the methods of working safely with stone are extremely well known. This isn't some new safety issue. We're not trying to design new ways to keep workers safe kind of as they work with stone. But increasingly over the last decade, where we've seen this uptake of artificial stone, predominantly used in kitchens as bench tops, but in a whole range of other applications in workplaces and homes as well, we've seen employers just seem to drop the ball on these basic safety measures that they were supposed to implement. And in context, natural stone has a silica content of about 10 to 45%, depending on the stone that you're cutting. Artificial stone has between 80 and 95% silica. Yet when moving between the kind of 10 to 45% to the 95% product, amazingly, industry somehow forgot all the well-known and well-used safety precautions you're supposed to use when cutting stone, and just kind of threw caution into the wind and made a lot of money out of the product. And, you know, these safety measures may not have been alone enough to protect workers from a product that probably just should be banned. It certainly would have saved countless workers from developing an industrial disease that we've long thought was eradicated. So, you know, in context, we have seen the WA government in recent times move to make some good changes in this space. One of the changes that Minister Johnson and Minister Dawson have implemented has really laid bare actually how bad the problem is. WA was the first jurisdiction in Australia to move from health monitoring of these workers from X-rays to low-dose CT scans, kind of recognising that X-rays just weren't fit for purpose in terms of actually identifying silicosis cases in workers. And I'll come to this a lot more later, but WorkSafe has recently transitioned from being a non-functioning regulator completely absent in the safety space to being a more effective regulator. I wouldn't go so far to lavish praise on them, but they are a lot more effective than they used to be. WorkSafe went back and actually conducted a really interesting project to try and uncover the depths of the problems of silicosis in our community. They went back and found 90 workers who'd been completely cleared of any harm, and they went and gave them CT scans. So these are workers who'd had X-rays, completely cleared of any harm, still working in the industry, gave them CTs. And half of those workers were discovered to have health problems associated with their work and lung problems. Even more frightening, 7 workers who'd previously been completely cleared of any harm were discovered to have silicosis. So half out of 90, 7 out of 90 previously cleared had silicosis. And this 90 that they went and retested was only really a tiny proportion of the industry. Very few have come forward for testing after leaving the industry, and very sadly, given that this is an industry that uses a large proportion of overseas temporary workers, like we know for sure that the industry sourced overseas temporary workers for convenience and gain. They've come into this country, worked in this country, in this industry, developed silicosis. We've given them no health support and then sent them back to their country of origin with permanent disabilities associated with their silicosis. And I actually think that's a great shame on this country, the level that we've exploited those overseas workers in this industry and then just completely washed our hands of the harm that we've caused to them before sending them back to their country of origin. And there's absolutely no follow-up being done in this space. There's been nothing to track these people down. There's been nothing to support other workers who've been in the industry. You know, and this is an industry that really should have, at the time and even now, lost all social licence to operate. Yet they're still continuing with no repercussions. We haven't seen one single prosecution of an employer in the space. And we've done absolutely nothing to eradicate the product. The product's still out there being used, and I'm sure many of you have seen recently renovated kitchens or have recently renovated kitchens have probably seen artificial stone being cut and used. The term the next asbestos is often thrown around a lot in Australia, and I generally disagree with the term because I think it's a nice little talking point for the media, but it's never really true. And if it is true, it's probably diesel exhaust and not artificial stone, but I think artificial stone in this context warrants some of the comparisons. The second challenge I wanted to touch on, which I think goes away from undermining the structures that exist to, I suppose, undermining worker involvement in the safety space, is really the kind of move in the safety space to over-professionalise workplace safety, which, funnily enough, that's us being a victim of our own success. Our push to increase regulation and involvement of workers in occupational safety has led to a massive new profession, which is workplace safety professionals. And over many, many years, this has been an extremely positive development. It's led to people whose sole role it was to enter workplaces, assist employers to make workplaces safe, and it has significantly driven down the injury rates and deaths in workplaces. But I think in more recent years, there has been some more sinister undertones that's kind of been rolled into this at times. And unfortunately, one of those is that as workplace safety gets more professionalised, it's taking the worker's voice out of occupational safety. And that's of course not to say that safety professionals are bad in any sense. In fact, it's the complete opposite. There's many well-meaning and good people in the safety space. But there is certainly a trend going against those reforms of the 80s around worker involvement in the space that has really come from safety professionals. And I'm very much of the firm belief that, because of this, we've seen an absolutely huge decline in workplace safety representatives and occupational safety committees in our workplaces. On average at the moment, we're training between 3,000 and 3,500 safety reps a year in WA. This is down just on kind of 5 or 6 years ago where we were training between 5,000 and 6,000. And before that, it was numbers far higher than that. An ACTU survey recently identified that unionised workplaces, about 70% of them have safety representatives. So if we're only training 3,500 a year at the moment, I can only imagine that the density of safety representatives in non-union workplaces is in the teens, I think, if we're lucky. This is, the key Robins reform, the key reform of the 80s, safety reps, just being absolutely eradicated from our workplaces. And I think the professionalisation of safety means that employers think that they've done their job by hiring a safety professional or bringing in a safety consultant for a day here or there. There is no need for worker involvement because there is these, what do the workers know about occupational safety? We've got these university-educated, well-meaning people who, they know what they're doing. We don't need workers. We don't need safety committees. We don't need that involvement in occupational safety. And this definitely isn't the view of the safety professional sector, but I will just touch briefly on, I think, some of the noise we've started to hear from safety professionals in recent times as it relates to the occupational safety reforms in the last year that I'll talk about later. The peak body for safety professionals, the Safety Institute of Australia, openly admitted in the debate about industrial manslaughter that if tougher penalties passed, that they believe that safety professionals would adjust their behaviour to protect employers against prosecutions rather than report incidents to the regulator. In a submission to the Legislative Council Legislation Committee on the Work Health and Safety Bill, they quoted a member in their submission that said that tougher penalties in the Act were, quote, a cash grab by the state government to boost the bottom line of the balance sheet under the guise of improving work health and safety. The same submission opposed notification requirements that would have meant that employers would have to report things like serious PTSD to the regulator because apparently it went against harmonisation. I was kind of surprised about, Safety Professional Institute arguing against provisions to ensure things like PTSD were reported to the regulator after a workplace injury. There was a silver lining to some of these submissions, and that was that they dealt themselves out of the debate in the parliament and in the community, and I'll come to that a bit later. But as unions, we have to fight against this idea that that there's employers or safety professionals are there to dole out protections to workers in the workplace, as opposed to workers having a legitimate voice in safety. The third, and no doubt the most major challenge we've seen in the work health and safety space has been the long-term systemic undermining of the regulator, WorkSafe. And union officials in the room, or recent union officials in the room, will know this only too well. And I could probably spend many, many hours on this subject and share my few opinions on the regulator, but I think I'm just going to pick out a few public reports and things that have been on the public record about the conduct of the regulator, rather than go on a rant for a couple of hours. The first was our first real public insight into how dysfunctional the regulator's investigations of workplace fatalities were and how they absolutely bungled their dealings with the family members of deceased workers. We've seen this as unions firsthand in workplaces where there's been workplace fatalities. And I reflect on some of the fights that we've had for months and months and months, even to get WorkSafe to address workers after the event of a workplace fatality. And Steve's nodding because that was an AMW workplace. There was a 2015 report from the state coroner that really went into the details about WorkSafe's conduct as it related to a workplace fatality. The fatality was an Australia Post worker who was delivering kind of mail on a suburban street was hit and killed by a bobcat reversing out of a residential construction site on a street. After that fatality, in the immediate aftermath, WorkSafe refused to investigate, incorrectly making the assumption that because the Australia Post regulator was regulated by the Commonwealth, that it would fall under the jurisdiction of Comcare. Now that would be amazing to anyone who kind of practices occupational safety, because of course the company that caused the fatality fell squarely within the jurisdiction of WorkSafe, and WorkSafe would have been the only regulator who had any ability to take enforcement or compliance actions in relation to the death. Now, in the coroner's report, it was interesting that WorkSafe inspectors internally rung alarm bells about this and WorkSafe's refusal to investigate a workplace fatality. Despite being 100% correct, the inspectors, WorkSafe, senior officials in WorkSafe continuously refused to launch an investigation into the fatality. Until about some point, 10 months after the fatality, they figured it out and realised that they were on the hook for being the agency that actually had carriage of the workplace death. And they did an extremely rudimentary investigation of the fatality. Of course, they knew that this was far too late to really do a meaningful investigation or launch compliance activities into a workplace death. They never interviewed the driver of the bobcat that had hit the worker. They couldn't investigate the site where it occurred, because of course there was a residential construction site, all well and truly finished 10 months later. And then they closed the file on the fatality without following the internal documented procedures at WorkSafe that would have ensured independent oversight of their ability not to investigate or prosecute the fatality. And in the coroner's report is actually extremely scathing about this. And I'll just do two quotes from the coroner's report, but I'll remove any of the names, kind of the associated kind of officials or victims in the report. The coroner had a firm belief that the activity was unsafe. She said, "It was apparent from his evidence that the driver made an assumption that if his lights and beepers were operating, people approaching would know to keep out of his way. But that is a dangerous assumption to make in such circumstances." The coroner then remarked, a senior WorkSafe official also acknowledged that if the WorkSafe investigation had commenced at an earlier stage, it might have led to a different outcome in terms of a WorkSafe prosecution being commenced. There is nothing that can be done about this now. The statute of limitation period has expired. This report is just a great example of how WorkSafe was bungling, and occasionally still is bungling, workplace fatality investigations. And the ultimate outcomes of this was that we had a workplace fatality that wasn't investigated properly or anywhere near the standards that anyone in the community or workers would expect. There was no actual real deliberations about whether a prosecution should be undertaken, and and the most important part was that absolutely nothing changed after the death to protect workers. Workplace fatalities should be the opportunity to learn and stop other incidents occurring in the future, and absolutely nothing like that occurred. And unfortunately, actually, having been in the position of supporting families in the aftermath of workplace fatalities, the coroner made just quite a telling point about WorkSafe's interaction with the widow. And the widow had to kind of keep on badgering WorkSafe to investigate, and unfortunately it just wasn't occurring. And the coroner said, "I can understand the frustration and sadness of the widow at how these investigations into her husband's sudden death proceeded and stalled. The consultation process was limited, and she has spent considerable time on her own trying to piece together and understand what occurred." Just absolute basic failure from WorkSafe to assist the family member if someone's died in the aftermath. This rings extremely true for both myself and probably many other unions about the dysfunction at WorkSafe. Another major accounting of the failures of the regulator occurred via a long Legislative Council inquiry from the Public Administration Committee, which expired in 2020. Finished in 2020. It was quite a considerable parliamentary committee report. It was a massive book, so probably take far too long again to go through the details. But they investigated WorkSafe beginning in 2017 and finished in 2020. From a union perspective, we actually had quite high hopes of this committee being able to kind of give us a document that allows us to reform the regulator. However, kind of in the time between 2017 and 2020, we're left to kind of go on our own way, and especially the evidence that I gave in 2017 at that committee actually bore no relevance to how the regulator looked in 2020 by the time it reported. And Comrade Stephanie Mayman, I think, remembers the long time that committee took to report. But aside from us having to run our own game independent of this committee, they did really highlight, I think, a number of the failings that we've seen. And, if you really want something to go to sleep with tonight, you can go and download it and have a read. But there was a whole number of key findings, especially around the culture of WorkSafe, their poor handling of investigations. And I'll just pull out two quick quotes from that report. The first was that the committee is of the view that WorkSafe's efforts fall short of reasonable community expectations in meeting their objectives with regard to health and safety representatives and unions, with whom there is insufficient communication at all levels. And secondly, one of the other main recommendations, which rings very true, is that WorkSafe's procedures and processes for communicating with bereaved families is overly bureaucratic and risk adverse. It lacks transparency, fails to take into account the needs of bereaved families, and fails to properly and reasonably consider the true likelihood of the release of information to a bereaved family, which they believe will prejudice the investigation of any future prosecution. So again, just talking about a regulator that can't even communicate with family members competently or correctly. And lastly, on the regulator, kind of the third major report that we've seen that kind of spelled out the issues that we've had with them. Of course, we rely on our regulator not just to be active in our workplaces, but also to do a whole series of other functions. And one of the main ones, the most important ones in the West Australian context, is the licensing of asbestos. In May last year, the Auditor-General released a report into WorkSafe's regulation of asbestos removalists. And you would think in a state with the history of asbestos that we have and the legacy of Whittle and, the legacy of it still remaining in all our buildings, I can't think of actually a more key area of licensing for WorkSafe. And actually particularly right in the last kind of decade where we're at a critical point of the lifespan of asbestos products, now kind of entering the phase where they're pretty much universally deteriorating and needing to be removed. Now, I'll quote the Auditor-General again kind of on how they kind of spelled out the problems with WorkSafe. But they said there are significant gaps in WorkSafe's processes and practices which limit how effectively it regulates asbestos licensing removal. Audits by WorkSafe are not comprehensive, nor consistently undertaken or documented, and do not routinely or regularly include inspections of workplaces when asbestos material is removed. They also said that there are sufficient deficiencies in WorkSafe's overall monitoring and compliance activities in relation to asbestos. So again, just the regulator fundamentally failing. And much like the coroner, I think, when you look at the Auditor-General and the Parliamentary Committee, really highlights, I think, the importance of some of these critical oversight bodies have had of WorkSafe and other functions in our community. But clearly, as one of our major challenges, has been the regulator, and they've obviously failed to fulfil their function for a very long period of time. If workers can't rely on a workplace safety inspectorate to function, and at the very least, investigate the deaths of workers in workplaces. If we can't rely on a regulator in a state with the legacy of asbestos we have to ensure compliance of those removing asbestos in our homes and our workplaces, and if they can't be expected to treat the families of deceased workers with dignity and respect, really, what is the use of them at all? And while I think, there's been this kind of piecemeal of reports and criticisms of WorkSafe over the years, but I think ultimately as an institution, they've got off extremely lightly for how they've fundamentally failed workers in this state over a long period of time. Not a long period of time, over the last decade. So, you can see with that frame, I think some of the challenges that modern union officials have kind of had in the work health and safety space. So to finally get onto the topic about why we're actually here, how we won, I wouldn't necessarily say we've won. We won the legislation battle, and we're winning the regulator battle, which I'll talk to for quite a while, I think. So we have to have a long-term focus on the regulator. This isn't an area where we can just allow to go. And recently we've had a very short-term focus on legislation. And while I think many of the issues relating to WorkSafe have been cultural or funding related, The impact of actually having kind of outdated legislation also has been a problem in how they've taken out their duties. But also having a regulator without kind of modernised enforcement powers wouldn't have the same impact as a regulator with new laws. So the first of the two I'll just touch on is the regulator before I go into the legislation. As I said, it's a long-term project and it's not finished yet. It's not like we can just go to WorkSafe and tip a big bucket of money in there and assume that all of a sudden they're going to start resolving their internal issues and resolving their cultural issues and assisting working people and families. That's just not the case. One of the major changes we've made was ensuring that there's actually a WorkSafe commissioner that's been appointed who's independent. So traditionally, we've had a WorkSafe commissioner that's just been part of WorkSafe, and WorkSafe for a long period of time was just essentially been forgotten about by government and left to wither on the vine. Actually appointing someone who's independent of the department, someone extremely experienced in occupational health and safety, and someone who has previously been a union official and kind of dealt with families of deceased workers and dealt with workers on workplaces after fatalities, has delivered results. The kind of other issue that we've kind of managed to resolve in the regulator and really fought for is resources. So under the Byrne government, they suffered cut after cut after cut, efficiency dividend, redundancies. They shredded staff out of WorkSafe over a long period of time. Many unions at the time, believed that was definitely deliberate. Removed the ability of the inspector to regulate effectively and reduce the power of a workplace safety regulator. We've seen 3 very good announcements from the current government in relation to this. They first kind of tipped 6 inspectors in early 2019, then another 24 in late 2019, both under Minister Johnson, and then at the most recent budget under Minister Dawson, they've tipped about 30 to 40 extra resources and inspectors into WorkSafe. So quite significant wins from a union movement perspective, and actually, an area where we've actually started to see some benefit from in having an inspectorate with greater powers and ability to regulate. I kind of spelled out an example about their inability to investigate earlier, and luckily we have seen that start to turn around in recent times, and I'll just touch on a few small things from there. I'll talk a bit later about the Curtin Fatality, the building collapse at Curtin, something that definitely shouldn't happen in Western Australia in this day and age. But when you think about how they handled workplace fatalities previously, it's been encouraging to see WorkSafe actually book out a large warehouse, take every single piece of kind of that collapsed building that they could, take it into a warehouse and begin to forensically analyse it and recreate what occurred. This wouldn't have been something that would have occurred at WorkSafe kind of a decade ago. They would have, whinged about not having enough resources. They wouldn't have spent the money they needed to actually figure out what happened. And when you have a building collapse like that, the regulator should be on top of it, discovering what the root cause was and ensuring that everything is audited to make sure another collapse doesn't happen again. We, in reforming the regulator and pushing them to be better, we've also actually seen a substantial increase in prosecutions. And I'll talk about some of the families earlier where they didn't have their prosecutions launched into the deaths of their loved ones. But even regardless of the legislation, we've actually managed to get penalties which have included jail time under the current Act by the media and the other pressure to push the regulator to properly investigate. There was a matter with a company called MT Sheds in the southwest, which had a $605,000 fine, and the owner and director was jailed for 8 months, and that's occurred extremely recently. This is the first jail sentence in our history of the state under occupational safety law, and definitely not something that would have occurred a few years ago if the regulator hadn't if the regulator hadn't have been recently reformed to the point where they're willing to take these things on with an independent commissioner who's willing to actually chase prosecutions and not just go for the easy wins. I might just quote that case because just a small section of that case, because I think it does actually talk about when you do have a regulator who's willing to take it on and get wins, that they'll get results. And in the case, and I'll just quote the magistrate, that they said that the employer held direct responsibility for the health and safety of its workers, that responsibility is not mitigated or diminished by the circumstances of the company or its directors. It may be that the implementation of training in a small organisation means lost hours of workers. However, that is a matter, given the serious risks that may arise from the lack of training, that should be built into every business where the risk arises. This is quite a long decision that was handed down, and there's a few little choice bits like that out of the decision that we haven't seen in the sentencing of occupational safety prosecutions for quite some time. And it's things like that that actually give me hope that turning around the regulator and turning around the legislation means that we might actually have a deterrent effect in terms of workplace fatalities in this state. And we're going to see with the reform of the Act other quite significant changes with the regulator, and part of that's going to be bringing mine safety into WorkSafe, and then we'll actually finally have an independent commissioner for both the mines and general industry in WA, which will hopefully deliver good results. There are exceptionally good and committed people at WorkSafe, but they've been let down by resourcing and a culture and a leadership that has undermined them for quite some time. I was then now going to talk about kind of the importance of the legislation, which is, I suppose, why you're all here tonight. I'll save you all from a boring couple of hours on the provisions and the detail of the legislation. I will get into one or two rabbit holes, but won't bore you all to death with occupational health and safety detail. I think the story is an important one to tell, particularly as it related to the families of deceased workers who really drove these reforms. It's worth noting that the national harmonised laws already represented quite a significant improvement on WA's laws as a whole for working people and their safety, but it was always incumbent of the union movement to try and go further than that. The model laws often get portrayed nationally as like the maximum benchmark or the benchmark of what you can adopt, and you can't deviate from that. It was a very deliberate decision of the union movement for quite some time to try and move out of that frame and to characterise the laws as the minimum benchmark where, every state should go above and beyond in terms of protecting workers' health and safety. We've seen a whole number of attempts of governments to try and bring in these harmonised laws. The Gallop government, or the Carpenter government at the time, committed to do it. Unions then had to beat back an attempt by the Byrne government to introduce the model laws. The Byrne government put forward a set of laws that would have massively reduced the kind of compliance and the standards of occupational safety, and it was a key union victory at that time to knock it back. And then the third attempt with the McGowan government. And I think, myself and Steph and many others have had a fair bit of harmonisation fatigue kind of through these processes until we finally landed a win in WA. Internally in unions, we knew that once this bit of legislation got done, that it would remain largely unchanged for 20 or more years. We knew that we needed to go big and be ambitious, although, of course, that might have been a different strategy if we knew what the landslide of the last election was going to be. But at the time, we were operating under the assumption that you couldn't assume that there would be an election win for Labor at the next election, and that was our chance to try and get occupational safety reform. We had to identify the key areas we needed to influence to counter the challenges that were going to come our way and ensure that the Act was right for the future. So I'll just touch on a number of the very high-level wins that we got in the Act and how it relates, I suppose, and improves the framework of wins that were embedded by Harold and Neil and others in the 80s. The first was to really look at the safety rep provisions and look at the ability to improve those to ensure that we can get more safety reps elected. As a key, we've removed the need for unions to consult with need for workers to consult with the employer on their choice of training provider and where they go. A great win to get more union training done. We've embedded the ability for a worker or a union to ask the regulator or ask an inspector to enter a workplace to resolve a dispute, and put a cap of 48 hours for the inspector to come into the WorkSafe to resolve that dispute. So I talked earlier about the problems we've got with the regulator. Well, we've now got an ability to force them into a workplace and ensure compliance with the legislation. We've finally embedded the union rights to appeal the decisions of inspectors and the commissioner. Those rights have always sat with employers and they've always sat with individual workers, but for the first time, unions are going to be able to kind of make those appeals, which will definitely make workplaces safer. We went hard after penalties and enforcement being a kind of key area that we needed to address. We implemented industrial manslaughter in this state. We also, alongside that, significantly reformed other offences in the Act, which pretty much got ignored in the debate, but were probably the most important part, and I'll come to that later. And we got a prohibition on insuring against penalties. Again, if we're going to build compliance with occupational health and safety, the ability for employers to insure against penalties in the Act was always going to be a problem for us, and I'm glad that we managed to get rid of that. And we've also got inserted into the Act new duties of care. That means that external service providers, such as safety consultants, trainers, and other professionals, now have a direct duty of care under the Act, and that was a particular passion of Stephanie's that we managed to get implemented. And again, going back to one of those challenges for earlier, getting those duties of cares on some of those classes of professionals was important. So how do we get that win? Well, first and foremost, every single union pulled together. There was a lot of internal debate in the union movement about what we were to fight for. I didn't always win on that either, unfortunately. But, I think when there was agreement in unions, I think the important thing was that everyone went out and stuck with it and campaigned for it. Once the unions kind of had consensus internally about what we wanted to fight for, we had to convince the Labor Party. That was an extremely lengthy process to get there and develop that Act. They set up a ministerial advisory panel set to kind of inform them about the legislation, chaired by Stephanie Mayman. That took 12, 18 months to kind of finish up and deliver its final report to government. They then had submission processes on that, which then involved lobbying from unions. And there were many unions kind of involved in the ins and outs of these kind of parts, but there were 3 unions that particularly carried an extremely heavy load on behalf of the movement. And those 3 were the AMWU, the CFMU, and the SSTU. Those unions carried a heavy load, along with others, to kind of win the government at length in negotiations. And I think the union movement took a smart view that we couldn't just rock up to government and say, well, you're a Labor government, we've got this view, you need to do what we say. And in fact, I think, knowing the personalities in government, that would have been a certain way not to achieve the outcomes that we wanted to achieve. We had the strength of the arguments on our side, and we weren't lazy about it. We went through with government in great detail, I think, where the failures were in the legislation and the environment, and moved them to kind of support us. Once government was won, which I've taken a very long story and made it very short, we had to move on to the Parliament, which I think was where the key battle for our reforms lay. At the time, again, not knowing what was going to come out of the following election, we had to deal with quite a hostile upper house in how we negotiated and implemented these laws. To pass provisions, we needed agreement of either the Greens and One Nation, or one of 3 quite conservative independents, or we needed the Nationals or the Liberals. The Liberals were pretty much out of the question, so really the campaign rested on winning kind of one of the 3 independents alongside the Greens or the Nationals. Suffice to say, of course, the Greens were very strong and vocal backers of the legislation. It wasn't necessarily hard to move them and bring them on side with getting it done. Alison Zamon and others in that caucus worked extremely hard to get through. But in terms of winning the others, really, I think it's worth reflecting here on the families of deceased workers. We had a naturally conservative, hostile upper house, had to convince people who, would never be seen to talk to a union, let alone support union-friendly provisions through the Parliament, to come on side and support this legislation. When we got to the upper house debate, after it sailed through the lower house, there was actually a deliberate strategy for unions to completely vacate the space. Unions agreed to step away, which, as you can imagine, is not something that unions like to do, especially when there's a fight to be had on occupational health and safety. But we knew that the strongest voice here was going to be the families, and we deliberately stepped away from the public debate for large portions of that time. But saying that, the families came to work with us, and I'm going to talk about those for a little while, but it wasn't just an accident that there were these groups of family members who were committed to getting occupational health and safety reform and greater penalties for the deaths of workers. we'd been there for them for decades. And many of the families that were involved in this debate, had unions like the CFMEU kind of supporting them in the days, months and many years after the deaths of their family members. They knew that, I think, when they came to us, that we would support them. And when we started to campaign in occupational health and safety, they just came out of the woodwork. Families that either we had dealt with for many, many years and assisted, or families who just knew that we could be trusted, even though we hadn't have had dealings with them before. I would come into work and have emails in my inbox or messages on my voicemail of just family members of deceased workers that I'd never talked to before who had found out what was coming and were lining up to be involved and join a campaign for better health and safety laws. They naturally knew that the union movement was on their side and that we would fight tooth and nail for better reforms. I was going to play a short video of one of those families to give you an idea about the strength of their advocacy kind of through the campaigns that we led. And now let's see if I can actually get this working.
Eddie was killed in a workplace accident in 2002. So he went to work and he didn't come home. Our children were small. I have a son, he was 12 at the time, and my daughter was 8. And I was left there with 2 small children and little or no support, and the only support I had at that time came from the CFMEU. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to rear my children here, and I wouldn't have been able to look after them. It was their support that brought me through. My 2 children now think they have no faith in a system that fails and fails and fails, because they watched what happened to me. So they have no faith in a system in WA. If you go to work, you're entitled to come home.
So I think, as you can see, kind of us vacating the space and letting these voices enter the space left us with an extremely powerful narrative. That was Patricia Kelch, whose husband Desmond died after he was crushed by concrete and steel on a building site in Myaree in 2002. And standing next to her, and also just out of shot, was Mark and Janice Murray, whose son Luke died in 2007 on a construction site in Malaga. Both those families are long-term friends of the union movement, and both families give major credit to the CFMEU for both being on site after the fatality, but also supporting their families kind of in the aftermath of the deaths. Not only those families, but we had a number of friends of ours, of the movement, who we either met along the way or we'd had some involvement with, and I just will give them direct credit, I think, now. We had Tony and Robin Hampton, whose son drowned working for Pass Bailey Pearls in 2012. We had Greg Zappelli, whose 18-year-old son was electrocuted on work experience when he went into a roof space that hadn't been isolated. We had Christina Patterson, whose partner died on a construction site at Karratha Airport. Sharon Westerman, whose son died on a drill rig in the Pilbara. We had the Cunicos, whose husband and father died on a wastewater treatment facility plant in 2018. And of course we had a good friend of the movement, Regan Ballantyne, whose 17-year-old son fell to death in the H&M retail building construction site in the Perth CBD. Now, these families, when they came and campaigned with us for better laws and greater penalties, relived very significant psychological trauma. Like, they had to relive these incidents and the aftermath of these things again and again and again. And credit to them, they turned up to so many press conferences through the campaign to tell their story. They attended parliamentary committees, which I'll talk about in a minute, and retold their stories again and again. And all of them spent a lot of time in one-on-one meetings with Conservative crossbenchers and the Liberal and National parties to try and bring them over on the legislation. And in fact, got so across the legislation that they were having quite sophisticated debates about, whole manner of things around the legal and the justice system. While nothing will bring their families back, of course, I can't say enough or give enough credit about the legacy that they've left kind of through this campaigning. Through reliving kind of the trauma and tragedy, their stories gave us phenomenal strength. And we would be here with much, much weaker workplace safety laws and protections for working people if it wasn't for them. Now, really, when the real fight began in the Legislative Council, and when we had the families at the centre of the campaign, we had to kind of go through 2 parliamentary committees, one of which was quite a significant investigation. We knew that the employers were approaching these committees and ready to campaign against industrial manslaughter and against greater penalty provisions. And we knew that through these committees, at the very least, we had to salvage a draw. These committees were controlled by the Conservative side of politics. They didn't have a majority of Labor or the Greens on them. And actually there was as we watched the debate unfold, we actually deliberately let employers blow themselves up. We knew that really all but one of the employer bodies would overreact to industrial manslaughter, and they definitely did so at the expense of pretty much all the other union wins in the Act. They chased industrial manslaughter down the rabbit hole, and that's the only thing they ever talked about. And actually to this day, I still don't think they really know a whole bunch of the wins that we got in the Act that they ignored because they just got so hyped up around industrial manslaughter. One of the major changes we got was reforms to, say, like other offence provisions, which actually quite significantly lowered the prosecution requirements for and significant penalties for other workplace incidents and deaths, which I thought would always have a more greater impact than industrial manslaughter, but instead all they talked about was industrial manslaughter, which has high thresholds to prosecution, will always be a difficult thing for employers to prosecute. And as the kind of overreaction to industrial manslaughter unfolded, we sat back and actually let their dishonest campaign kind of run its course. And they continued and continued and continued with a very dishonest campaign about industrial manslaughter, which I'll come to in a second. And I'm convinced that actually their approach was that they were convinced that they'd won before we'd started. They looked at the numbers in the upper house, they looked at the numbers on the committee, and they thought there's no way the unions are going to be able to get this legislation through. And just said whatever they wanted and got lazy with their arguments. To give an example of kind of the overreaction, I'll use kind of 2 points from local governments in relation to the inquiry. They submitted to the parliamentary inquiry that if someone breaks into a work site and is illegally and is killed, will the PCBU be charged with industrial manslaughter? They also said if a worker is bitten by an insect or snake on a work site and dies, will the employer be charged with industrial manslaughter? Like, these are the kind of questions that they're putting up about, kind of offence provisions with very high thresholds. Both of those kind of, questions that they posed were completely bonkers scenarios and not things that kind of could ever kind of be approached with industrial manslaughter. And even this is still continuing. I think the Master Builders Association was in the media the last couple of months saying that if a homeless person was broke into and camped on a building site and died, that the builder would be locked up for industrial manslaughter. Like, they still haven't learned their lessons about these ridiculous kind of equations and scenarios they've campaigned on. The pastoralists and graziers kind of in the parliamentary committee said, and this is one of my favourite quotes from the committee, he said, "There are 5 people in my workplace, it's a family farm and I am one of the 5. I waste an inordinate amount of time on making my workplace, on making absolutely certain that our workplace is as safe as it possibly can be." Now, in the face of family members campaigning around the deaths of their loved ones, I'm not sure they got a lot of strategic advice on calling workplace safety a waste of time. But turning up in front of a parliamentary committee and saying those things, I actually think moved the Conservative members of Parliament to actually onto our side. The employers were so ridiculous with how they campaigned. And we knew this was coming and we waited for it. And I think once it hit, it allowed us to respond kind of calmly, but with some fury in putting to bed their nonsense and eradicating them from the debate. And one of the ways that we did that was with some strategic kind of work with the families. And people like Regan and others kind of picked it up and slammed the employers, both in letters to them directly and other employers, absolutely going them for their ludicrous scenarios and some of the things they came up with. And this worked for us. We got families in front of the inquiry. We got countless families to submit directly around their impacts. And when you put that against the things that the employers were saying, it certainly moved the debate in our favour. Unions went in quite conservatively. We gave consistent evidence. We didn't overreact. We didn't kind of use terms around industrial manslaughter that misled. We went in with the law. And despite actually advocating for pretty radical law reform, unions ended up being the reasonable voice in the debate. And while the majority of the kind of committee were Conservatives, we we salvaged the draw out of these committees. They didn't completely recommend that the laws be rejected and the laws be scrapped, and that was good for us. Now, this debate then went on for months, and I won't go through the back and forth, I think, of a lot of this debate. But after kind of weeks and weeks, if not months, of parliamentary sitting, after the families had given their evidence, for some unknown reason, the Liberals started going directly after the families on the floor of Parliament. They started disputing the family members' versions of the events of the fatalities of their loved ones. Everything from the length of time it took to get the body of Jared Hampton out of the water after he drowned, as told by his mother and father, to starting to dispute the employment arrangements of the 17-year-old or 18-year-old who was electrocuted in a roof space, as told by his father. And then they started disputing whether or not any greater enforcement or any greater penalties in legislation would have actually led to greater justice for these families. To this day, I can't really work out what motivated these MPs to go after the families directly and go after their stories directly and attack them. But what I do know is that my phone then blew up from all the families every night for a week. They were absolutely appalled. And they started going after the leaders of the Liberal Party directly. And then soon after that, there was the building collapse at Curtin University. I don't want to get into that incident too much, but of course, a large construction site falling down is not something that should ever occur in Australia, shouldn't occur anywhere around the world. And actually, I was incredibly lucky that there wasn't kind of 10, 20 fatalities associated with that. There was one death and one worker who will never be the same, who suffered catastrophic injuries. At the time of that, and at the time of the Liberals attacking the families, I thought we were out of time. I thought we weren't going to get the legislation done. The Libs were talking it out. We're running out of time in the parliamentary debate. And timing was pretty critical. And there was a very obvious delaying tactic from the Liberals that was starting to bite. I think the Liberals going after the families and the families hitting back directly, and then the Curtin Fatality turned the tide of public opinion. And the families coming out in the media going, Liberals who needed to be re-elected in the Parliament directly, about kind of talking about their stories worked. We went from months of contested votes on every single section, almost every single section of the bill, to then having the bill pass in a week. It was kind of a bit of an anticlimax to get these reforms kind of off the back of that. But I think it certainly saved kind of, well, my hair from going grey, but also many other union officials and the families from greater harm due to what was going on. We ended up winning the Nationals over on actually quite a few sections, which was a surprise to us, and that was due to the work of the families. We won ex-One Nation Member of Parliament across on almost all of it. Still bitter about the one thing he didn't vote with us on, but he came with us on almost everything. And I think actually critically, the thing that he didn't come across on is that we lost one of the two higher elements of the industrial manslaughter offence, which was a shame. But we held strong and rejected, I think, attempts to gut the bill. There was a late attempt to gut the bill to a manner that we would have actually had to campaign against it if that occurred in the offence provisions. The Liberals were supporting a push to undermine the offence provisions in the Act and make it even harder to prosecute workplace fatalities than it is under the current Act, which is something that we would have had to campaign against. But now that this campaign is wrapped up, really, I think it's worth giving credit to kind of the families and how that victory was won, and it certainly wouldn't have been done without them. I think the lessons of the last 2 decades really is that if we leave the legislation unchecked without attention, it'll be undermined again. There was a good win for us having Labor ministers, and particular Labor ministers and the Premier, invested in the process, and it delivered us substantial outcomes. It is really kind of the best example of Labor governments and how they can work with the union movement to achieve results, I think, was through this process. But it's not something that we can always rely on. To be honest, union skills in this area are definitely lacking. I think you look back to Harold and others and how they set up occupational safety committees in the TLC and they campaigned for greater skills in unions. It's certainly something we need to come back and address. Whereas it's a pretty small union movement in WA, really, but this isn't an area that we can ignore and let go. Also, the old union saying that using power builds power, I think certainly holds strong in this area. I think campaigning on occupational safety, using the families, has built our power on the issues and has led to greater penalties and greater compliance in the space. Having changed the regulators, we've also impacted the courts. We're seeing decisions that are now coming down, actually providing deterrence to employers and increasing compliance with the Act. And we've seen the pain in the families after they've lost loved ones, and certainly I think if we allowed our system to be undermined again, we'd see more families who are heartbroken. And just finally, to kind of wind up and reflect on the families, we owe them a debt, but also a responsibility. The responsibility to kind of fight back on the Act, to reform the regulator, and to work tirelessly to support other families in the future. I'll finish up on a quote from Regan Ballantyne, who was really the most prominent of the family members campaigning in the Act. When she talked about the death of her son, Wesley, she said, and the kind of lack of justice associated with kind of that death, as she said, "This is just another example of a two-tiered justice system, which is one set of rules for the common person and another set of rules for people who sit behind their corporate veils. We're talking about a situation where the head contractor knew there was an obvious and high-risk hazard but did nothing about it. But why would they? There are no consequences." We can't allow families to be in this space again, talking about the death of their kids in that way again. And certainly I would hope that the union movement has kind of done their part to turn that around. So thanks, everyone.